The pen didn't shake when I signed my name. That's the part I keep coming back to, not the moment I walked out. Not the night. Everything cracked open. But this one, sitting in a lawyer's office in Phoenix, Arizona, sliding a pen across the bottom of a divorce filing like I was signing off on a expense report. Steady hands. Clear head. No hesitation. Corinne slid the folder across the desk without ceremony, the way professionals do when they've seen this exact moment 100 times. And I thought about how 4 years of marriage ended, not with a fight or tears or anything loud, but with the quiet scratch of ink on paper in a room that smelled like recycled air and black coffee. My husband called me clingy. That was the word he chose. At 2:30 in the morning, when I asked where he'd been for 4 hours with a woman whose name had been showing up on his phone every single evening for months. A name he mentioned casually at first, then more often, then suddenly not at all. He said I was suffocating him, said he needed space, said love wasn't supposed to feel like a chain. And I stood there in our East Austin apartment in the dark, listening to a man dismantle 4 years of marriage with vocabulary designed to make concern sound like a character flaw. So I gave him exactly what he asked for. I gave him 840 miles of it. 1 year earlier, Austin, Texas, East Side apartment, 2nd floor, the one with the broken hallway light we kept saying we'd report and never did. I know the exact time Brendan walked through the door because I had been watching my phone for 3.5 hours, every message shifting from delivered to read without a single reply coming back. Each one a little shorter than the last, because at some point you run out of ways to ask the same question without sounding like what you actually are. Which is scared. He came in quiet, the way people do when they're hoping to avoid a conversation they know is waiting. Keys set down with deliberate softness. No lights turned on. Moving straight toward the bedroom like I wasn't there. And I said hi from the couch in the dark and watched him startle badly, hand going to his chest. His first reaction wasn't relief. It was irritation, visible even in the dim glow from the street outside. And I recognized that before he said a single word, he said he'd texted. I told him he'd texted at 11. It was nearly 3, and I'd heard nothing since. His voice started climbing before the sentence was even finished. And I felt something tighten in my chest because this wasn't the tone of someone who'd had a long night. This was the tone of someone who'd already decided how the conversation would end before he walked through the door. That's when I said her name. Renata Solis, the accountant at his company whose name first appeared in March, then more frequently, then stopped appearing in conversation entirely around June, while continuing to show up on his phone every single evening. Brendan's jaw tightened and he said it was a group thing. Drinks, and then someone's apartment. Nothing. He said he was a grown man. He said I watched him like he needed permission to breathe outside these 4 walls. And then he used the word clingy. Dropped it like a clinical finding. Like my asking where my husband was at 3 in the morning was a character flaw rather than a reasonable response to 4 hours of silence from someone who knew I was waiting. I repeated it back slowly, and he looked at me the way you look at someone who's just confirmed your point. Voice rising, telling me he felt suffocated. That love wasn't supposed to feel like a chain. Filling the apartment with words designed to make me the problem, in a room where I was the only one who'd been sitting alone, wondering if he was safe. I let him finish. Then I looked at him and said, "Okay. You want space. I'll give you space." He searched my face for the argument he'd prepared for, and didn't find it. Softened slightly. Said we'd talk in the morning. I told him to get some sleep. He went to bed. I sat back down on the couch in the dark and started making decisions. I waited 35 minutes until his breathing shifted into something deep and even, then opened my laptop on the kitchen counter without turning on a single light. I logged into our joint checking account and transferred exactly half the balance into my personal account, the one I'd kept since before we married and barely touched. Sitting at around $8,000 like a fire extinguisher I'd hoped never to need. Texas is a community property state. Half was already mine by law. I wasn't taking anything that didn't belong to me. I opened a new tab and searched for apartments in Phoenix, Arizona. Not because I knew anyone there, but because it was far enough to mean something and close enough to drive in a single stretch. I found a studio available for immediate move-in. Deposit and first month payable online through ACH transfer. No office visit required. I submitted the application at 9 inches the morning, and the automated approval came back at 4:22. I sat with that email on the screen for a moment. Not from hesitation, but because I wanted to feel whatever there was to feel before I kept moving. There wasn't much. Mostly the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the certainty that I was making the right call. My job was already fully remote. Environmental policy work for a nonprofit with no physical office requirement, which meant whether I logged in from Austin or Phoenix, the work stayed exactly the same. I drafted an email to HR about updating my address and saved it without sending, because that could wait until morning, and packing could not. I moved through the apartment the way you move through a space that was never quite yours, which I understood now more clearly than I had in 4 years of living inside it. What belonged to me fit into 3 suitcases and 2 boxes. Clothes. My laptop and work drives. A watercolor set still in its original packaging that I'd bought before the marriage and never opened because Brendan said we didn't have space for that kind of thing. Books he'd asked me to keep in the closet because they didn't match the shelving aesthetic. I carried everything down to my car in 4 trips. The old Subaru I'd paid off 2 years before we met. I left a note on the kitchen counter. 3 sentences. With my keys placed on top, I locked the door from the inside using the handle latch, pulled it shut behind me, and drove out of Austin while the city was still dark and completely unaware that anything had changed. Phoenix in October hits different than Austin. The heat is dry and sharp and doesn't apologize for itself, and I appreciated that more than I expected to when I pulled into the parking lot of my new building just after midnight with everything I owned loaded into a 10-year-old Subaru. The studio was small, bare, and smelled like fresh paint, which felt appropriate. I unrolled a sleeping bag on the concrete floor, set my laptop on top of a moving box, and lay there staring at the ceiling of a city that had no version of me in it yet. No history. No damage. Nothing that needed explaining. The first week I slept on the floor and worked from a folding chair I bought at a pharmacy for $18. My manager Jeff ran our weekly check-in the same way he always did. Asked about the federal wetlands assessment I was drafting. Noted that my turnaround time was faster than usual. And never once commented that the background behind me had changed from the Austin apartment to a blank white wall. Remote work is honest that way. It doesn't care where you are as long as the file lands in the shared drive before the deadline. I sent HR my new address on day 3 and updated my direct deposit. That was the administrative end of my old life. Handled in 2 emails before 9 in the morning. I bought a mattress in week 2 because my back was starting to affect my focus. And focus was the only currency I had right now. I started running at 5:30 in the morning before the sun got high enough to make the pavement dangerous. 1 mile the first day. Then 3. Then 5 by the end of the month. I hadn't run consistently since college. Brendan used to say I only had 2 speeds, and running wasn't one of them. And I thought about that exactly once, while pushing through mile 4 on a Tuesday, and then I didn't think about it again. The apartment stayed mostly empty through the first month. I didn't rush to fill it because I'd spent 4 years inside a home filled with things chosen by someone else's taste, and I wanted to know what I actually wanted before I bought a single chair. By week 6, something shifted. A coworker made an offhand comment during a video call that my background looked like a transit lounge, and everyone laughed, including me. But I looked around after the call ended and understood she wasn't wrong. The walls were bare, the surfaces were clear, and the whole place looked like I was ready to leave at any moment, which is exactly how I'd been living. That weekend, I drove to an art market and bought a desert landscape, painting in orange and deep purple, the kind of bold, unapologetic color Brendan would have called excessive. I hung it the same afternoon. Then I opened the watercolor set for the first time, spread paper across the kitchen floor, and painted nothing in particular for 2 hours. That was the first thing I had done in 4 years that belonged entirely to me. Month 3. Corinne Aldridge, a divorce attorney I'd met through a mutual contact at work, kept texting to invite me to her weekend climbing group at a gym on the north side of Phoenix. I declined twice, then said yes on the third ask, mostly because declining a persistent, genuinely kind person takes more energy than just showing up. The group was small, 5 or 6 people, and nobody asked why I'd moved to Phoenix or what I did before I got there. They asked if I'd ever climbed before and whether I wanted to try the overhang. That was the right kind of question for where I was. By month 5, the Saturday climbs had turned into dinner afterward at Marcus Okafor's apartment. A systems engineer who cooked well and talked plainly, and never made the evenings feel like they required anything from anyone. One night he looked across the table and asked, directly, but without any edge to it, whether I'd come to Phoenix for work or to get away from something. I took a moment before answering. Both. I told him. My husband called me clingy because I asked where he was at 2 a.m. with a woman whose name kept showing up on his phone every night. So I gave him the space he asked for. Literally. The table went quiet for a beat. Just the sound of forks and the low noise of the street outside. And then Marcus nodded slowly and said, "That's not clingy. That's evidence." Corinne set her glass down and looked at me with the specific focus of someone who had heard this story in a professional context more times than she could count. "Have you filed for divorce yet?" I shook my head. "Then let's fix that," she said. "I'll give you the friend rate." It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was just 2 people at a kitchen table. One of them finally ready to close something she'd been leaving half open for months, and the other one handing her the means to do it. Corinne filed the paperwork the following week. Finding Brendan's current address took less effort than I expected. His sister Petra had posted a birthday photo on a public Instagram account, location tagged, and in the background, unmistakably, Brendan's car parked outside the same East Austin building we'd shared. He hadn't moved. I had rebuilt an entire life and he was still standing in the same spot. I sent Corinne the screenshot, and she had a process server at his door within 48 hours. Served. Confirmed. Acknowledged. 3 days later, an email arrived from HR at Lone Star Infrastructure Group. They had me listed as Brendan's emergency contact, which neither of us had ever updated. And they were reaching out regarding an internal investigation into unauthorized expenditures on project accounts. I opened the attached transaction summary and read through it slowly. Hotel stays. Restaurant charges. 2-person travel billed to a infrastructure site inspection that company records showed was a solo assignment. Renata Solis, the accountant with system-level access to those same project accounts, had been the one processing the expense approvals. I read the list twice, not because I needed more evidence of the betrayal, but because I finally understood the full shape of what I'd been living inside. Brendan hadn't just needed me quiet about where he was at night. He needed me stable, present, and unquestioning, because a husband with a solid marriage and a reliable wife reads as low risk to a company. I wasn't his partner. I was his cover. Renata wasn't someone who fell into something complicated. She was an accountant with clearance to move numbers around, and she had used that access deliberately, alongside Brendan, for long enough that the paper trail had grown thick enough for HR to flag it without anyone tipping them off. I forwarded the entire email chain to Corinne with one line attached: "Add this to the file if it's useful." Then I closed the laptop and went for a run. 5 miles in the dry Phoenix heat, and didn't think about either of them once. Gwen Marsh, Brendan's mother, found me through a Facebook account she'd created just for this purpose. A profile with no photo and 2 friends. which told me everything about how deliberate the effort was. Her message was calm and measured, the way someone writes when they've drafted it several times before sending. She said Brendan wasn't okay, that he'd been spiraling since the papers arrived, that she didn't know what had happened between us, but whatever it was, she was asking me to wait. I called her back the same evening. Once. Because she had always been decent to me, and she deserved a real conversation instead of silence. I told her exactly what happened, the hours of no reply. Renata's name on his phone every night. The word clingy used 3 times in one argument to shut down a question any spouse would ask. Gwen went quiet for a long moment and then said she understood. And she didn't call again. Brendan's lawyer reached me a week later with a condition. Brendan would sign if I agreed to meet him in person. 1 hour. Just to talk. I listened to the full pitch before responding. No, I said. And when the lawyer started to reframe it, I said it again. Slower. If he's in pain, that's a conversation for his therapist. Not for me. If he wants to contest this, we'll see each other in court. I have time. I have Corinne. And I have the HR documentation from his own company. 3 days later, Brendan signed. No conditions. No counteroffer. No further contact. Brendan was terminated from Lone Star Infrastructure Group 6 weeks after the internal investigation concluded. Renata Solis was let go the same week and reported to the Texas State Board of Public Accountancy. Her CPA license placed under review for conduct violations tied to the expense account manipulation. I didn't find any of this out by tracking them. Corinne mentioned it in passing at the gym. The way you mention weather. Because in a city like Phoenix, information moves through people who pay attention, and she was one of them. My divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning. Corinne texted me the confirmation while I was in a video call reviewing a federal wetlands impact report. And I read it, set my phone face down, and finished the meeting. That afternoon, I was promoted to Senior Policy Director, a title that came with a salary increase significant enough that I moved out of the studio and into a small house on the west side of Phoenix, with a porch facing the desert and enough wall space for every painting I'd made since. October. I hung them all. Bold colors. Wide brushstrokes. Nothing that matched anything else. Exactly the kind of work Brendan would have called excessive. He wanted space. I gave him 840 miles of it, and used every one of them to build something he never could have been part of anyway. I walked into that house carrying only what was mine, and for the first time in 4 years, that was more than enough. If this story sat with you in any way, drop your city in the comments. There's a piece of my own life woven into Delia's, and I'd love to know where it's landing. Finding your way back to yourself is quiet work, and it's worth every mile.